You often hear people say to check your ego. Check your ego, bro, as though it's some sort of bad thing. But when they're speaking about ego in this sense, more often than not, they're speaking about their pride and they're conflating ego with pride. Now, of course, pride is a bad thing. However, ego is something that I would argue that we cannot get rid of. It is on us 24/7. So, what is ego? Well, I'm going to discuss that today on Trees Philosophies. Welcome, buddy. This is Trees Philosophies. This will go deeper in my thoughts, ideas, visions, meditations. People always told me I go too deep. Well, I go deeper, baby. Anyways, let's get into it. So, again, when people refer to ego, they have some sort of abstract idea or understanding of what it might be. But when you ask them about it, they can't really define it. Again, oftentimes it's referred to as this negative thing, this negative characteristic that we should get rid of. But I will argue again that this is something that is part of us and part of our nature. So I want to provide a deeper understanding of what is ego. Now, one of the classical definitions comes from Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud defined the ego as this balancing act between the id and the superego. The id being our carnal nature, our desire for pleasure and pure satisfaction, and our superego being on the opposite end of the spectrum, and that being our godly nature, our desire for morality and ethics and things of that sort. So, and then the ego is the balancing act that tries to go and balance between our carnal nature and our godly nature. However, the limitation of this understanding is that it implies that the ego is only involved in these circumstances. It's only involved as some sort of balance between our fleshly desires, our physical desires, and our godly nature, our godly desires. Now, this is limited. Again, because I would argue that the ego is a part of us 24/7, maybe except for when we're sleeping, but that's a whole nother conversation. So I want to provide a different definition for what an ego is. What is the ego that goes a bit deeper? See, the ego, as I see it, is a lens. It is a lens that filters information from the environment through the lens and into ourself, into our identity. And then also it is a lens that filters the information from our identity into the environment. Right? So what does that mean? That means that whenever information comes from the environment, whenever we speak to others, whenever we see things, whenever we interact with the world, that information first comes through the lens of our ego and then enters our self. See, that lens is based on our historical experiences, on our understandings, on our cultures and traditions. It is what allows us to filter that information and give it meaning. That's why somebody can have the exact same information fed to them as somebody else, but interpret it in totally different way. Why does that happen, right? Maybe you see a wink from a girl and then one guy thinks it's one thing. Oh, I guess she's into me. And then another guy is like scared or backs off from it. Well, that's based on the ego. That's based on the lens through which that information gets filtered before it reaches the self. Eye contact, or even showing the bottoms of your shoes. Again, all these different bits of information that we see from the environment. One culture, one person might see this as something respectful. Another might see it as something disrespectful. Again, this is the ego that filters this information and allows that to then refract into ourselves. Similarly, when we speak, when we express ourselves, again, it goes through the filter of the ego until it reaches the environment. That's why if somebody's, for example, the smart person, right? The nerd, they have the ego and that self that, oh, well, I'm the smart person. I don't say something dumb. So therefore, I need to filter myself such that I don't make myself look stupid. Right before I speak, I need to make sure that I filter it through the ego, through that lens, such that what I say is perceived as something that a smart person would say. Or if you're the jock, again, you have this identity, this self, and maybe you have many forms of self. However, because you've come to perceive yourself due to your ego, you've come to perceive yourself as that person, then you might not want to do something or say something that would be outside of what your ego tells you are, because again, you've pigeonholed yourself into that identity. You've made yourself to be what your ego tells you are. Now, ultimately, for us to become our full selves, to transcend beyond the ego, we need to suffer an ego death. And ego death is very difficult to do. And why? Because what that means is that you need to kill off that part of yourself and allow yourself to transcend beyond that identity that is given to you by the ego. Now, what I would say is that a lot of people nowadays in modern times try to do this via psychedelic drugs or some form of meditation or whatever, right? That's why you hear people will say, oh, you break through the doors of perception via a huge psychedelic dose of mushrooms or LSD or whatever type of drug. However, I would argue that the ultimate form of ego death is given to us in the example of Christ in the baptism, right? When Christ gets baptized, you see how he transcends, right? And similarly, he goes through a death and is rearisen. And that I believe that is what the baptism represents. It is an opportunity to die, allow your old identity to die. And now the ego is renewed and enveloped by the superego of God, right? So the true, again, the true ego death, the everlasting ego death is the one of baptism, is the one of salvation through Christ. Because in that instance, after you've gone through salvation, after you've received Christ, you've given your life to God, and you've gone through the baptism, what you are expressing to the world is that now you are enveloping your ego with the superego. You are enveloping your identity with the identity of God, such that the information that comes to you and the information that comes through you into the environment is now not only filtered through your own ego, however, it is filtered through the ego of God. This is the ultimate form of ego death, because now your ego transcends just the ego of self, but rather is an ego that is expressed and enveloped and deepened by virtue of the superego of God. So to me, this is the ultimate idea of ego and transcending the ego via the ego death, of releasing ourselves via salvation and the process of baptism. Now, I want to say that these are not mainstream ideas. This is just my own perceptions. So if you have comments, concerns, please let me know and I'd be happy to have a conversation. And I'll leave off with this. An ego death might be difficult. It is difficult. However, a life lived in submission to the ego, a life lived as a slave to the ego, is arguably a million times worse. In fact, I know it is a million times worse, because being a slave to the ego means limiting the self, limiting the potential of the self. However, when you allow that ego to be transcended, when you allow that ego to be enveloped by the ego of God, this is the true sense of ego death, the everlasting and eternal ego death. Be a slave to God instead of a slave to your ego. Thank you so much for sticking around this long. If you like this, please subscribe, share it with a friend, share it with somebody that might benefit. And if you like this video, I have another one right here that I think you're also going to like. This is Trees Philosophies, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, my brothers and sisters.
I'm the cream of the crop, I'm the belle of the ball. Take me to the top, cause I ain't never scared to fall. I was prepared to brawl, don't care if I have